We had some technical difficulties, but I think we have overcome them. And I'm so glad to see everyone this evening. I'm Andrew Goss, and I'm president of the Brotherhood of Congregation Emanu here in Houston, Texas. Tonight, our special guest is Richard Murray, who is the chair in urban public policy in the Department of Political Science for the University of Houston. Dr. Murray is a native of Louisiana with a BA and an MA degrees in government from Louisiana State University and a PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota. I'm not going to give you the years because I don't want to embarrass him. Dr. Murray has taught at the University of Houston since 1966. After serving as director of the university's Center for Public Policy for over 9 years, he is now concentrating on the center's polling operations as the director of the Survey Research Institute. His academic interests are in Houston and Texas politics, focusing on campaigns and elections, political parties and interest groups, and public opinion. And he's written extensively in these areas, including co-authoring Texas Politics, an Introduction, and Pro-Growth Politics, Change and Governance in Houston, while teaching courses ranging from graduate seminars to introductory American government. Professor Murray has previously consulted in more than 200 political campaigns. He conducts polls for the Houston Chronicle, other media and local governments, and is a political commentator for the local ABC affiliate, KTRK Channel 13. In addition, his analyses and commentary are carried by television and radio, as well as print media such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and the Houston Chronicle. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Murray.
Thank you and good evening. I'm sorry that I contributed to the technical difficulties, but let's get on with the evening. You know, we're in a very interesting period in American politics. I've obviously been around for a while, as my brief bio suggests. As I was winding down my teaching career at UH, I requested that I wanted to teach all year in 2020 because I, of course, knew it was a presidential year. I thought we were going to be looking at a very challenging and unusual year. I had, of course, no idea of the COVID virus that was coming and how this would turn our whole country and our election system upside down. You know, a year later, we're still sorting out a lot of these reverberations as we now have a new administration that, you know, tonight the president is going to, for the first time, address the country as president and the Congress. So let's take a quick back step and look at what's happened in the last 12 months. A year ago, Joe Biden suddenly broke through a huge Democratic field, 20 plus candidates, where early on he seemed to be faltering. You know, Bernie Sanders seemed to be surging. And then all of a sudden, everything changed in a matter of 3 weeks, triggered mostly by the South Carolina primary result, where African-American voters, prompted in part by James Clyburn, the long-serving congressman and iconic figure in the Black community there, endorsed Biden. 2-3 days later, he wins the South Carolina primary. 3 days later, the Texas primary, and 9 others. And basically, the Democratic race was over in a matter of days. Shockingly quick. Then the virus shut down normal politicking. And, you know, we went into a long, unsettled period without the usual political action that we expect in a presidential year. Donald Trump was Donald Trump, what he's been ever since he emerged on the scene, a highly unconventional, controversial figure that drives voters either to dislike him or strongly support him. And of course, on his watch, for the first time in 100 years, we had a terrible health pandemic. Normally, a crisis for an incumbent president is an opportunity, but pretty clearly, with the benefit of retrospective, Donald Trump missed it by yielding to his kind of New York salesman tabloid mentality that had developed over his 70 plus years of life. He fudged. He wanted to claim it wasn't really a bad virus. It wasn't going to hurt anybody, even though he knew better. He claimed it was going to be gone by April and March, and it wasn't. Even in April 2021, it isn't. So, a president that probably had a better than even chance of being reelected when all of this stuff started a little over a year ago, basically blew it. By not taking the virus seriously enough, by not focusing, by not putting together a team or listening to the team that were credible. But still remember, it was an incredibly close election at the end, not in the popular vote. It was pretty clear from most political scientists that Trump could not win in the popular vote, but we know from 2016, he didn't need to win in the popular vote. It's the electoral college. And in the states that were close, Trump was very competitive. And at the end, he lost them narrowly, just as he had won narrowly in 2016. But despite an 7-8 million popular vote difference, the shift of just a couple of 100,000 votes strategically in states like Michigan, Florida, or Arizona, or rather Georgia, could have tipped the election back to Donald John Trump. But that didn't happen. He lost and ended up with exactly the same electoral votes that Hillary Clinton had won in 2016. But of course, then things got really interesting where normally in American politics, even when the losers are bitterly resentful and dislike the result, the American tradition going back well over 100 years is that the apparent loser concedes the election. That started in 1896 when William Jennings Bryan sent a telegram to William McKinley congratulating him on his victory. In 2000, we had the Al Gore George Bush race, which was almost impossible to figure out who had won Florida because it was essentially a tie. Came down to a judicial ruling. But Gore followed the American tradition 20 years ago. He said in December, when the Supreme Court had ruled that the recount must stop and that George Bush is a bit ahead, I think 537 votes out of 6 million, Vice President Gore said, "While I bitterly disagree with the Supreme Court decision, I accept it." And a few weeks later, when he was presiding in the Senate as the elector or votes were being read from around the country, he refused to support any move by Democratic senators to challenge any state's result. Boy, that seems like ancient history today. Remember in 2016, an election Hillary Clinton was widely expected to win. And there was this great ballroom, I guess, in Brooklyn, where they were going to have this huge shattering of the glass ceiling that symbolized American women not being able to reach the highest office. And of course, the ceiling held. It wasn't shattered. But as it became clear late at night, approaching midnight in New York and 11 o'clock in Houston, that Donald John Trump had won the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton, no doubt grinding her teeth mightily, went on live television and conceded the election. But that didn't happen, of course. On November 4th, 2020, Donald Trump bitterly contests from 2 p.m. the morning, I guess, early morning after the election, that the election result was fraudulent. And so we had this extraordinary period of weeks where there were questions about every state certifying its results. Gradually, they did so. It reconfirmed that the state counts were going to stay the same. But still, that had to be certified by Congress in January. And So, 2 months after the election, we had something we hadn't seen in American politics ever. The capital of the United States being stormed by supporters of the candidate that had lost the election. And to many of us, egged on, urged on by that candidate who did not intervene to shut down this riot. An extraordinary moment in American politics that we are still sorting out what it means. Hundreds of people have been charged with insurrection or other crimes. None have gone yet to trial. But it was an incredibly disturbing moment in the American political history. And interestingly, in the Senate, 7 or so Republican senators voted not with the president's claims that are widely considered to be without merit, not to certify the election results. And in the House, 150 of the 200 or so Republicans did so, creating a continuing, ongoing controversy about the 2020 election that's nowhere near solved or over. And it's created a very perilous moment, I think, in American democracy. Democracy just doesn't depend upon the constitutional rules and the legal opinions. A lot of it is tradition and acceptance of norms. And we saw those norms violated dramatically in November, December, January, February. And we still have an ex-president that refuses to concede that he actually lost the election. And it's a very rare or raw moment in our political democracy. But whether he conceded or not, and he is not, the process moved forward. The election was certified. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was sworn in as the 46th president of the United States at noon on January 20th, with the retiring president nowhere in evidence. That had not happened, I believe, since 1828, when John Quincy Adams refused to attend the swearing in of President Andrew Jackson. So we're at a moment of extreme polarization in American politics. And the two parties have drifted far apart in their supporters. So, but the election for most Americans is over. And while it's a long way until the next rounds, the midterm elections in 2022 and the presidential election in 2024, what happened over the last months, the election and the follow-up, are a deep shadow, in my opinion, on our electoral process. So we have, it seems to me, as a longtime student of political parties, two tremendously different political parties in America today. One, the Democratic Party, looks an awful lot like it's been for nearly 200 years. That is a coalitional party. The Democrats, the modern Democratic Party, was cobbled together in the 1820s in the wake of Andrew Jackson's loss for the presidency in 1824, and was a party that brought together a bunch of people that didn't necessarily share a tremendous amount of agreement about a fundamental range of issues, but thought that they needed a vehicle to advance their interest. So the original Democratic Party was a coalition of working class folks, Southerners, small property owners, et cetera, immigrants that were starting to flood into the North, a lot of Protestants, a lot of Catholics, a few Jews that were coming into the country. And the Democratic Party 200 years later still has some semblance of that. It's not a party with a huge center of gravity. If you look at America, this incredibly diverse country, the Democratic Party is the party that has still a lot of Catholics, like the incumbent president. It has a lot of Jewish folks, not all by any means. It has a majority of Hispanics and a huge majority of Blacks, but none of those constitute anything near a majority. It's an ideologically diverse party, ranging from Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a pretty conservative Democrat, to AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the highly visible young congresswoman from the Bronx and I guess Queens. But this is pretty much the way the Democratic Party's always been. a very diverse party that it's not easy to hold together because, for many years it included the most liberal elements in American politics, like the labor leader Walter Reuther, and the most conservative members on issues like race, like James Eastland of Mississippi. And to a great degree, you still have that kind of big, broad coalitional party. But the Republican Party's gone a very different way since the 1960s. It's become much more a party increasingly of white conservatives, particularly of evangelical Christians and others that are concerned about the loss of traditional values. It has a really much more focused center of gravity. And there are virtually no liberals left in the modern Republican Party. There are still some conservatives like Manchin in the Democratic Party, not very many moderates. The Republican Party has become a party of largely white conservatives, and a party that is fed a continuing stream of information from sources like Fox Media that play to this polarization that exists in America. It's good business for Fox News. That's a very, very successful business enterprise. It makes the party difficult to win majorities. The Republican candidate for president has won exactly one of the last 8 elections popular vote. That's George W. Bush in 2004. But because the Electoral College is tilted toward the smaller and more rural and conservative states, the Republicans have won presidential elections without winning the popular vote, as of course we saw with Bush in 2000 and with Donald Trump in 2016. But there's a palpable sense on the Republican side that the country's slipping away, that some of the issues that have held the party together are not going to work in the future. A lot of younger voters are interested in moving on from concerns like opposition to abortion. So the new Republican Party modern Republican Party, not the new Republican Party, is sort of scrambling to find a sense and direction. After the surprising to many Republicans defeat of Mitt Romney in 2012, the party commissioned an autopsy and it said, well, America's changing. The Republican Party's got to change. We've got to open ourselves up and broaden our base of party, particularly reach out to the growing populations of Latinos, Asian Americans, people coming to America from other parts of the world. Become a big tent party again. Most of the Republican candidates who ran for president in 2015 pretty much tried to follow that script like Jeb Bush, but not Donald Trump. He basically took that autopsy report, which I think the party paid about $20 million for, and threw it in the trash can and ran on a very different program that highlights not so much a policy set of positions, but a sense of grievance that Americans are losing, that people are losing ground, that something has to be done. We've got to, as he put it famously, make America great again, and tapping into these growing resentments. Some of them make perfect sense. I mean, for many working class people, the last 30 years have been a pretty big disaster. We've seen a lot of increase of wealth in America, but it's tilted enormously toward people at the very top. And so in addition to concerns about a loss of religious values and sort of a moral compass, many Americans are deeply, deeply disappointed by the economic performance of our country and the fact that it hasn't reached out to them. And Trump expertly tapped into those resentments. Some of it, you could argue, was racism, but also genuine economic angst, some of which we could see back in 1992 when Ross Perot tapped into some of those same feelings. This global economy has not worked for a lot of Americans. The trade deals have not worked for a lot of Americans. And Trump, whatever else his talents are, is an expert salesman. And he sold this very different vision, quite at contrast with much of the traditional Republican playbook about international trading, being a country that is opening and welcoming, a beacon for the world democracies. Trump ran on an America First program. And he won in the Electoral College. And he governed that way. Never much interested in the details of policy. He was still holding strong with his base until the pandemic upset everything and caught out with an administration that had been substantially de-staffed, that lacked professional expertise, that lacked a president that could focus on a major problem that the public wanted something done. He lost the election. But notably, unlike previous presidential losers, he didn't fade from the spotlight. George W. Bush, finishing his second term limited period in office, went back to Texas and started painting. Other presidents start supervising building their pyramid, their presidential library. Generally, they stay out of partisan politics, including within their own party. And that's not the Trump script. So we have this extraordinary period. You'd probably have to go back 100 years to Theodore Roosevelt, an ex-president who quickly after leaving office in 2008 regretted doing so. He was not term limited out and became a very vocal and energetic player, both within the party and in the general elections. So it's not unprecedented to have a former president, but it's been 100 years since we've seen someone so politically active as President Trump. He has cemented in the weeks since the election his control over the Republican Party structures. In Texas and virtually every other major Republican state outside of the Northeast, Trump supporters control the state parties. And whatever their private feelings might be, virtually all elected Republicans, with a handful of exceptions, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, have fallen in line. So we have this extraordinarily unusual situation that a former president remains a defeated former president, not term limited out, the leader of his party, for better or worse. Some challengers, Liz Cheney, the congresswoman from Wyoming being most notable, but there are lonely voices out there right now. Obviously, the presidency is not up in 2022, but Donald Trump has made it very clear he's going to intervene across the country, supporting people that he thinks are loyal to him, supporting his continuing position that the election in 2020 was stolen. And we're just in uncharted waters in this respect. So, one of the great puzzles of American politics in the 2020s is, where does Donald Trump go? Where does the Republican Party go? And none of us knows, except that Trump ain't going quietly. Joe Biden, of course, won. The electoral vote was confirmed. He was sworn in. Many expected, including a lot of Democrats that had supported more progressive candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, that Biden would be a kind of a placeholder. He was, after all, 78 years old. No president ever been elected of that age or ever served. Ronald Reagan finished at, I think, age 77. But old Joe, Uncle Joe, has surprised us. All those years of waiting and watching and running twice for president and losing and then being rescued by Barack Obama as his vice president. Clearly, Joe Biden observed and learned something. And when finally, in an extraordinary turn of events of a few weeks of March 2020, he became the Democratic nominee and then was elected, he doesn't come to office with any small ideas. Although Biden was widely seen as one of the more moderate centrist members of the Democratic contingent of 20 plus running for president, he has clearly moved significantly toward the progressive position on a range of issues. And most often compares himself to FDR. If we look at the 20th century presidents that had a major domestic agenda and able to advance it, that would, of course, be Franklin Delano Roosevelt and more recently, Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. And Biden is the first Democratic candidate and now president that is trying to move in that same direction. He's had some early success, of course. He was able to get a huge stimulus bill passed, more than twice the size of the one that Barack Obama was able to get through in 2009. And it's now laying out, and will do so again tonight, a very ambitious domestic agenda. with the slimmest of majorities possible in the House and the Senate. There's enormous question as to whether the parts of this that require legislative action will be successful. But unquestionably, that's the ambition that Joe Biden has laid out. He has, in my judgment, clearly benefited by being such a dramatic change in tone and temperament from Donald Trump. Trump was out there every day, blasting away, attacking his enemies, running a chaotic administration, and that's not Biden. Biden has assembled a team of very long-standing folks that have worked with him. If there was no drama Obama, there's certainly much even less than that with Biden. He's pushing this agenda forward. He got a big chunk of it passed early. He's got a couple of more big bites at the apple. After that, who knows? Usually a new president with a Congress in the House and Senate loses ground in the 2022 election. So if history's any guide, there's only about one chance in 10 that the Democrats will improve their position in Congress. Now, because of the way the Senate is set up, there are more Republican seats that are up. The Democrats probably have better than a 50% chance of holding, if not increasing, their Senate advantage. The House of Representatives, where unexpectedly they lost 10 seats or so, the history suggests Republicans likely take the House. But, you know, history indicates patterns. It doesn't tell us the future. We're about to do redistricting in Texas and elsewhere. That doesn't look like it's going to be as big a change as possible. Not that many seats are moving. And even in a state like Texas, where Republicans control all the levers of redistricting power, virtually all the population growth in the state is in areas that are more Democratic. So in a state where Republicans hold 23 of the 36 congressional seats to just 13 of the Democrats, but where Republicans' majorities are much closer than that in elections, expanding that in Texas is not going to be easy. So redistricting will be fascinating to watch, but don't look for it producing dramatic changes. More important will be what voters decide in 2022. Biden seems to be off to a very good start in dealing with job number one, getting this COVID under control by a very aggressive, disciplined vaccination program. The expectation of economists now is that the economy is likely to come roaring back. Americans have saved a lot of money after all, because they've not done a lot of the usual things. So Biden may have more wind at his back because of some credit for dealing with the COVID and a strong economy. Some economists are predicting the highest growth levels in 40 or 50 years. But then you have again, the traditional pattern that a party of the president that controls the House and Senate loses ground. None of us knows how this will play out. Lots of things can happen between now and October, November 2022 when we start voting. But it will be a consequential midterm election because Joseph Biden has indicated he ain't a placeholder. He's an aggressive president pursuing a different vision that has dominated at the top levels of Washington since Lyndon Johnson. So as a longtime political scientist, I'm appreciating the fact that, gee, these are interesting times again. Donald Trump is one of the most fascinating, if not the most fascinating ex-president in our history. He solidified his control of the Republican Party. We're heading into a contentious redistricting fight across the country. Here in Texas, battles over restricting or not restricting voting. So I like the old Betty Davis line from All About Eve, I think it's 1952 movie, buckle your seatbelts, we're in for a bumpy ride. So why don't we open up to questions from our audience, and let's see if we can get over to the chat.
If you have a question, would you please put it in the chat?
Questions, and we can get going on that. Okay. Not seeing anything yet on the chat front.
Dr. Murray,
Yes.
I'm interested in finding out your thoughts about states that are trying to impose great restrictions on voting and how that might play in 2022. And if you also think the Supreme Court might rule against them in some way.
On the latter, I don't think the Supreme Court is likely to intervene. You know, it is a very conservative court with 6, Republican appointees and 3 new ones that were all appointed by Trump. It had been under Roberts, it had been moving away from federal court intervention to protect particularly minority voting interest. So I don't think that the federal courts are likely to intervene. So I think much in states like Texas, where there are these aggressive pushes in the legislature to try to rein in, especially jurisdictions like Harris County, that were making it a lot easier to vote in 2020. So I think this one's going to be fought out in the political trenches. I just don't know what I think we will in Texas, as in Georgia, end up passing significantly more restrictive legislation, and that is not likely to be overturned by the federal courts. But I think there's a pretty good chance that these motivations and plans will not work. First, you've got people out there, notably like Stacey Abrams down in Georgia, that have been waving their arms for years and saying, they're trying to keep us from voting, therefore let's go vote. So this could produce an energized bunch of folks on the other side that now feel that it's more imperative than ever to show up at the polls. Also, the shakeup that Trump has brought in American politics. Republicans used to do well with well-educated and generally more affluent voters, like my neighbors across the street in West University. But Trump has driven away a lot of those voters. The Trump coalition is tilted toward much more white voters who didn't go to college or older. They're not so easy to turn out in a non-presidential election. I think the folks in West U that are significantly less Republican than they were 10 years ago, very likely to go vote. They're well informed, they have a lot of media sources. I'm not so sure that in places like Deer Park and east side of Harris County, where Trump's vote shot up, a lot of those folks will come back in a midterm election and maybe not even in the presidential election in 2024. One of the things we saw in the Georgia vote, there they had the first round of those Senate races in November 2000, that went to runoffs because there are special rules. So the runoff vote was in January, 3 months ago. And the Trump people had trouble getting their vote back out. And the Democrats won both of those Senate seats. So I think it's hugely uncertain whether this big push will in fact benefit Republicans. A lot of the Democratic voters today are better educated voters compared to what they were 15 or 20 years ago. So, life is full of uncertainties, and certainly elections are. And again, the historic pattern is the Democrats probably get beaten pretty badly, especially in the House of Representatives in 2022, but I'm not sure that history is going to hold. I think that in states like Texas, there could be a backlash. Virtually all the newspapers in the state have consistently attacked what the legislature is trying to do. Yes, a huge number of us now are committed partisans, Republican or Democrat, but there's still about 10% of the voters that are independent and are immovable. And generally, they don't like restrictions on voting much. We had this fantastic surge of voting in our state and around the country. And a lot of it was facilitated by making it easier to do things like, drive through and vote. Now, that was partly dealing with the COVID, but voters like the convenience of voting. So I don't have I actually do have a crystal ball, but it doesn't work. And you can't return a crystal ball. They're not refundable. So, I remember reading the obituary of a 90-year-old British historian a few years ago, who in sort of summing up his long views of human endeavors. So the only law that seemed to him to make any sense in terms of human activity was the law of unintended consequences. Be very wary of trying to achieve object A by making changes. Often you get changes, but very often not what you expected. And I think with this effort to try to slow down the fact that the major metropolitan areas in Texas and around the country are moving away from the Republican Party by putting in restrictions specifically aimed at counties like Harris and Dallas and Travis that have more than 1 million people, that could blow up. May or may not. Stay tuned. So, how should Texas Dems best prepare for 2022? Do you think that voter suppression bills will come along in Texas? As I think I just mentioned, I think they will. I think it's Senate Bill 6 and House Bill 7. They may be modified a little bit, but I think the legislature will pass them on a party line vote. The Democrats obviously have some big problems in Texas. We have no statewide bench. There's been a Democrat elected in Texas statewide since 1994. So, you know, the governor and most other significant state officers, but no senators are up in 2022. But, you know, Republicans have their team. You know, Greg Abbott's planning on running for re-election. The other statewide office holders seem to be trending in that direction. Some of them, like Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, look like they have major vulnerabilities. But we just don't know the Democratic slate. It takes somebody usually to beat somebody, and the Democrats don't yet have that somebody. You know, there are talks about getting Beto to come back, but, you know, he was not helped by his abortive race for president in 2020. You have the kind of deus ex machina notions that, well, what about some wealthy person, maybe Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks basketball team, who's a billionaire, would wade in. We saw Tony Sanchez try that back in 2002. That didn't work out too well. So the Democrats, you know, I think they can hone their message. There's a lot to work with. The Republicans are running the state and lately have not been running it particularly well on issues like ERCOT, the terrible failure of the state government to deliver for its citizens in the midst of this February freeze. But we still have this big question: who do the Democrats put up? Next question, can you talk a little bit more about redistricting in Texas in light of the 2 new House seats? First, of course, for a lot of Texans, we're thinking we're going to get 3 and it's only 2. That may be in part because, unlike many other states like New York and California that put some money and effort into trying to count everybody, the Texas Republican leadership were not interested. It looks like, you know, the fewer counted, the better. Well, maybe that accounts for the fact that we didn't get as many folks tallied in Texas, and that we will have 2 new seats, not 3. On the one hand, you've got the reality that Republicans control the Senate, the House, and they start drawing these districts, and the governor will, of course, sign whatever they produce. The federal courts have retreated. So the Republicans, sort of in a tennis match, they serve. They've got the opportunity to draw the districts, and that's a huge advantage. But as someone who's been started redistricting in 1971, Republicans have a big problem. That is, they have too many incumbents. Too many state senators, state House members, and Congress members that are in shaky districts. Like the head of the Republican redistricting effort is Senator Joan Huffman from Harris and Fort Bend counties. She won by less, I think, than 0.5%. Her district needs to be substantially changed. Well, most of the Democratic districts are full of nothing but Democrats. So you can't reach over and pull a lot of Democrats out of Republicans out of these Democratic districts. They don't exist. So as someone that has done my share of redistricting, and some might say gerrymandering, your options are more limited than usual in Texas because the growth is about 90% of the growth since 2010 is persons of color. Now, you know, as we saw very much, Trump did pretty well with a lot of Hispanic voters, with Asian voters. You can't just say Asians, Hispanics, and blacks all vote Democratic. They don't, blacks mostly, but not the other folks. But they do vote somewhat more Democratic than white people. So part of the drawing of the maps in Texas is going to be really complicated by 23 Republican Congress members up, 5 of whom just barely won last time. You're going to try to stretch that out and win these 2 new seats. In the state house, in the big urban counties, you can't cross county lines, which significantly reduces your ability to draw very clever districts. Harris County is a kind of a wall within itself. You have to draw all 24 districts within Harris County. So this will be my 6th and very likely last redistricting rodeo, but I look forward to it because everyone is different. And what's different this time is the continuing explosive growth in the metropolitan areas. And the whites that are moving to the metropolitan areas tend to be moving from affluent states like New York and California, and they're much less conservative and Republican than used to be the case. I grew up in Louisiana, and how many people move from Louisiana to Houston or Dallas? Too damned expensive now. But for somebody selling a home in California, Austin looks pretty good. So besides minority growth, the whites that are relocating to Texas tend to be more moderate or progressive. So the Republican map drawers have the great benefit of drawing the map, but they have the great challenge of trying to figure out a map that works. And I like the old Wall Street line, pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. Don't get too greedy. In 2011, the Republican map drawers looked at Dallas County, which was moving Democratic pretty rapidly, and tried to draw and did draw 8 of the 14 districts for the state house that elected Republicans. By the end of the decade, there were 2 left, and they very nearly lost those. They didn't provide enough leeway for every now and then you get a bad election, and very nearly lost the entire Dallas delegation. So it's a fascinating chess game that's about to start, and Republicans serve first. And let's see how aggressive they are. Do they try to protect incumbents, or do they try to reach for the maximum number of gains? Let's see what we've got next. How does President Trump floating around as a progressive candidate impact the GOP primary field? It freezes the Republican field. Even those very ambitious Republicans like Nikki Haley, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, need we mention our junior senator, Ted Cruz, they can't move until Trump says, I'm in or I'm out, because they don't want to take him home. So he's got this extraordinary ability to keep the field very, very narrow. And he would be a fool to move that away from that, because if Trump's, in a lot of trouble, financially, legally, his greatest asset is continued hold on the Republican base. And if he were to say, I'm not going to run, I'm not going to get involved, this would be squandering that asset. And he's not, therefore, as long as he is sentient and rational, he's not going to do that. So it ties up all these other ambitious Republicans because they can't move until they know what he's going to do. Because Trump punishes people that get in his way. And nobody wants to be identified as the #1 target as a potential presidential candidate of the former president. How do you explain Ken Paxton, the Tea Party? The big break in the Republican Party was in 2010, when the sort of traditional Republican establishment, George W. Bush, Rick Perry, Kay Bailey Hutchison, had a revolt, and the primary electorate swung sharply to the right. And folks like, we saw David Dewhurst a couple of years later unseated by Ted Cruz, and Paxton winning the Aziz race against candidates that looked to be significantly better qualified. And that dominance continues. Maybe there'll be a reaction within the Republican primary in 2022. Paxton's got a lot of problems when 7 or so of your staff members that are high level, very, very Christian conservative folks basically the boss is doing something that's illegal, you got a problem. But Paxson has been a master at dragging things out. But I don't think that's going to work through the next cycle. But I don't think George P. Bush is the answer to getting rid of Ken Paxson. How much do you think Republicans can increase their majorities in the Texas State House with redistricting? With increases in the population of the urban centers, meaning new seats have to come from those centers. I don't think they can increase. The current lineup in the House, the Democrats thought they had a shot at taking control, but they failed. It's still what it was before the last election. That's 83 Republican seats and 67 Democratic seats. Almost automatically, Republicans are going to lose 4 seats because the rural areas like the Panhandle and East Texas and much of West Texas, they don't have enough population. Those seats have to go away. Republicans were able to condition this in 2011 by eliminating seats in Dallas County and Harris County and moving the suburban areas. Can't do that this time. There's been enough growth in Dallas and Harris County to keep the delegations that we have. And again, you can't cross county lines in these big counties. So the best Republican map I could draw, if I were working for that party, would be to try to save about 80 Republican seats and concede that you're going to lose 70 to the Democrats. If you try to get more than 80, you're putting yourself at a real bind to lose your majority because you don't have much of a margin. And the population trends in the urban areas are generally not favorable. But remember, the reason Republicans kept their majority in 2020 was they did unexpectedly well with Hispanic voters. That cost the Democrats 4 or 5 seats in the state house. Will that continue? Nobody knows. Trump clearly turned out a lot of low propensity voters, including many Hispanics, that voted for him. But he's not going to be on the ballot in 2022. And it's anybody's guess. But what I do know is that the map drawing for the Republicans is most challenging with the state house. At more than 80 seats, look to me about you can't protect that any number more larger than that. That would mean a Republican reduction from an 83-62 margin to 80-70. And that's probably going to be hard to sustain over a decade. Next question, how do you explain Ken Paxson's, how can Texas voters still vote for him after his indictment and spending our tax dollars in other states? Voters don't pay much attention to the second level positions. You know, the presidency and the national stuff dominates. I guess Ken Paxson's name identity outside of the Republican primary electorate with Texans is probably 15 or 20%, maybe 25. He's been indicted, but he hasn't been convicted of anything. He's a Republican, and you know, more Texas Republican. There's still more Texas voters who see themselves as Republicans than Democrats. But I don't think, given the problems he's got in his own office, of his key staff members turning on him, and now in Washington, a Justice Department that is not going to be helpful if it comes to any possible federal crimes. I don't think Paxson will be the Attorney General of Texas in 2023. I don't know how he get there. Maybe he resigns, maybe he's defeated in the primary, maybe he loses the general election. But we got no shortage of Democrats who want to run against him, including the Joe Jaworski, the son of the former famous Watergate federal prosecutor. It looks like we're at about the end of our questions. So I'm sorry again for the technical glitches. Those are my fault at the front end, but enjoyed stopping by this evening, and look forward to going to see what Joe Biden has to say in the talking to the Congress. So
thank you so much, Dr. Murray. Very informative and certainly worth the time to listen to. I do want to suggest to people that the Brotherhood of Congregation Emanu will be hosting another speaker in May. On May 19th, we're going to have Dr. Elizabeth Slater of Rice University, who will be talking about stress and the ability to focus in the time of COVID. So for anyone who's living with stress or having the inability to focus like they'd like to, we invite you to please join us on May 19th at 7 p.m. Thank you so much for attending tonight, and let's go find out what the president has to say.